They have no knowledge of Jews, and it's just another group, and they can't comprehend. We can look at that as a good thing, because they don't have any built-in biases yet, but then they need to understand who the Jews are, just as they need to know about other groups as well. The other question that kids often don't understand is why, quote, they didn't fight back. You know, why didn't they grab their guns and go shooting? And that takes some explanation. We work with teachers on that to talk about all of the many different forms of resistance. And those kind of questions are very foreign to kids in the classrooms. So that's pretty much what we do. We do, as I said, at the Birmingham Holocaust Education Center, we work very hard to try to train teachers, to send them off to workshops. We conduct our own workshops. We have small learning sessions. Robbie Ballard works with us, so you'll hear from him as well.
My banner for Judaism and teaching the Holocaust as best I can. But people never expect that. People assume that I started teaching something about African American studies, or that I'm somehow teaching racism because I'm Black. I talk about racism because I need to explain to people anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism is a form of racism. And so the question that my students most often have has to do with this. How do we make sense of our whiteness and our Christian faith, bearing in mind the historical anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish attitudes in Christianity? And that's really, I start talking about the Nuremberg laws. Someone wants to talk to me about Jim Crow. I was kind of forced into talking about these two histories together. And the reason I wrote the article, which is titled From My Place, Teaching Judaism and the Holocaust 53 years after James Meredith, is because the situation of our campus, we are always embroiled in something that's related to race. Always. And I suppose that it will be that way until we can work through those issues there. So what brings these questions to my students is, one, I'm teaching a topic that has to do with racism. On the other hand, it's not about the Deep South, and it's not about African Americans. But they can't help but ask questions about the Deep South. And so over years of trying to understand how to talk to students about these two, I realized that it's this proximal knowledge. In other words, that these knowledges, kind of one circle here and a Venn diagram, they overlap in ways and they diverge in ways. And because I don't believe that we have hierarchies of suffering, I focus on helping students to understand from each tradition the things that are similar and the things that are different. And I feel that students have helped me to learn that if we are not so harsh if we're honest but not harsh in the ways that we approach them about these very painful topics. Because what I discovered is that my students, almost all of them, even the racists, let's be real, are in some level of pain. And so what I try to do is I back away, give them permission to feel the pain that they feel about these histories in whichever ways that they express them. And then I try to work with them from that point, rather than forcing them by pounding at them. What I try to do is, I start my classes by saying, this is the argument that I will make to you this semester. And you will tell me if I have done it successfully. And also, I don't want you to take my word for one, not on any of this. For every single thing, I will give you documentation. That's how I know it's in special collections. at our university, because I wanted to show students that this was not about me being black, and most of them think also that I'm Jewish, so that's okay with me. So it's not about me being black and Jewish. It's about me being a scholar interested in teaching them about these two really important histories and what their role is. Because I frequently say to them that I feel in many respects my generation has failed. So now they are going to be the teachers, the rabbis, the ministers, the senators, presidents, and I challenge them. What are you going to do about this? It's very easy to wag our fingers at those naughty Nazis and all of their collaborators, or those evil white people who wear sheets. But it's much more difficult for us to think about these in terms of the ways that Dr. Mitchell talked about, the everyday confrontations that we have. And I just try to, I try very hard to bring them to the facts on terms that they can accept. I force them to argue based on the facts. You can disagree with me, but you cannot disagree. I don't believe there.
Responses to persecution, 1933 through 1944. And I said, I think there'll be a segue because you've been recently involved in looking at primary sources and making primary sources, the importance of primary sources, available to students. So please come and share some of your thoughts.
Yeah, so perhaps I'll speak a little bit more generally about primary sources in the project and then focus on some of the specifics when we get to that question. I too am not directly in the classroom, but at the Mandel Center, we are charged with promoting the research and teaching of the Holocaust on the university level in a whole host of areas. And the area that I've been the most involved in has been revealing this history in, I think, surprising ways for students through the study of primary sources. And the way in which we have done that is through a digital primary source tool called Experiencing History that I've been very involved in. And I will say that this particular intersection of a topic between the Jim Crow South and Nazi Germany is a new one for this particular project. But that said, what the approach of teaching with primary sources and learning with primary sources, I think, really shows is it teases apart the multitude of perspectives on a particular moment. And it also makes it almost impossible for a student to make grand generalizations. All the Jews did X. Because when we are faced with 150 primary sources from Jews of various stripes and various affiliations at different moments in different places, which this tool illuminates, you can no longer speak about the Jews. You can speak about this person at this moment, in this place, in this letter. And all of a sudden, all of these bigger types of assumptions of, oh, all the Jews should have resisted, all the Jews should have left Germany start to break down. And that's one of the things that we hope to do as we approach this particular topic through a new content section on Americans and the Holocaust is thinking about we can no longer speak about all Americans. Who are we talking about when we say Americans? And even in this new collection that I'll give you a little bit of a preview of a bit later, we cannot even speak of all African Americans. This is too large a category. We can show the complexities through different perspectives at different moments. And that's one of the things that this type of study really, we hope, encourages students to do.
Thank you very much, Lady. The second part. Okay, so fifth panelist for today is Robbie Ballard, and Robbie is actually not only a native of Birmingham, but of this very part of Birmingham, the South Side. He teaches now American history at Altamont School, which is also nearby, relatively speaking, in the neighborhood. His current research focus is on using proven models including Germany's system of teaching about the Holocaust, to develop means by which civil rights education can be progressed beyond, say, just remembrance and memorializing it. So, Robbie, please come up and tell us more. We're particularly interested in the implications for the civil rights movement, of course.
Good afternoon. I spend most of my days hanging out with 10 and 11-year-olds, so hanging out with a bunch of adults today has been kind of a bummer. But this has been fantastic. Don't get me wrong. It's been an incredible symposium so far. Holy smokes, Dr. Mitchell, that was one of the most stirring speeches I've ever heard in my entire life. I can't stress that enough. So my research, the question I'm supposed to talk about here is, can teaching about Nazi Germany help us understand other instances of targeted racial violence such as the Jim Crow era in the United States and vice versa? I think it can, in the same way that an apple can teach us a few things about an orange. They're both fruit, they both have seeds inside, and they're both edible, and that's about it. The civil rights movement, which, to be clear, I define as the grassroots struggle for equality started by Black Americans following the end of Reconstruction in 1877. I consider the civil rights movement to still be ongoing, which is why our Civil Rights Institute is an institute, not a museum. Museums are for things of the past. The Institute studies things that are still happening. I really like that about the Civil Rights Institute. Off that segue. Anyway, they're similar in that they're human rights struggles and that they were systematic persecutions of groups of human beings based on factors outside of their control. Ethnicity in the case of Nazi Germany and race in the case of the United States. What my research mostly focuses on is how can we take teaching mechanisms from German education about the Holocaust and apply that to mechanisms with the civil rights movement. Not necessarily comparing them, not necessarily lumping them in together, but saying these are the nuts and bolts that are working in Germany right now. And of course, it is so impossible to define what the word working means, but they're doing a pretty dang good job of it compared to how we're doing with civil rights education here. And how can we use those mechanisms to better our approach? This goes back to something that the German Bundespräsident said in 1985 at the commemoration of the end of the 40th anniversary of the end of hostilities for World War II. He's giving a speech to all of West Germany, and he says, basically, all over the world right now, everybody is celebrating the fact that they kicked our asses 40 years ago. So what do we do? What are we gonna do here? And he goes on, he gives this very stirring speech about where we, speaking to Germans, where we as Germans go forward, and how do we use this in our benefit. The line that got me, that I think about probably 12 times every day, he said, the youth of Germany are not responsible for what happened over 40 years ago, but they are responsible for what they do with it. So what do they do with it? I went to Germany last year. I was very lucky to get a research grant and go, and I spoke with government officials, museum officials, teachers, regular people, you name it. I spoke with anybody who would speak to me, which was more than I think they wanted. The term international, and my wife brought the term international incident to my attention a few times. And I was asked by her to stop asking people on the subway about their experiences with Holocaust education, so I did. But what I found and what I heard universally is they want to instill an appreciation for democracy and for the German system of government, for the rule of law, and for the acceptance of truth. And so my question is then, in America, what do we say about the civil rights movement? What do we want to do with it? We can very easily say, never forget, never forget, never forget. Never forget what? Never forget to do what? Our civil rights education focuses so much on the horrors that happened, which we all need to be familiar with. That is 100% true. We need to be familiar with the horrors. But more than anything, we need to know why those horrors happened. And that's something that we don't discuss very much in our educational system. We talk about the civil rights movement as something that started in the 50s and ended in the 60s. And that's that. It started in 1877 when the movement for racial equality became grassroots. and it was no longer being supported by the federal government. And so what do we do with that? How do we approach that in such a way as to better our society through mechanisms more than just instilling guilt, instilling shame, instilling fear, and instilling anger? How do we make this productive, and how do we take our country forward while accepting ownership of this and accepting the debt of this? As a white Protestant male, I have a debt to pay, but that debt is not a burden. It's a debt, but it's not a burden. It's not penance, it's atonement. It's saying, this is something that I, as a native of Birmingham, I, as a white Protestant male in America, I have this debt. God knows I have enough privilege. Why not take on a debt too? You know? So that's kind of where it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate all the comments from the panelists so far. A variety of insights and philosophical reflections so far. So just in terms of thinking about the time and wanting to allow time for questions and comments and interaction with the audience and the panelists, the original plan was to allow you each 5 minutes to come back up again and talk again. Maybe I could urge you to take a little less, that's all right, because I think some of you at least went a little over this time, so don't want to be so harsh here. I'll let you go, right? So shall we go through the panel again? Would you like to come up? Sorry. Yeah. So, okay, Tina's suggesting we go directly into Q&A just to make sure there's time for that and that it's interactional. So thank you, Tina, for that brilliant suggestion. Let's do that. So, let me just one caveat or variation on this. I know perhaps, Leah, you had some other things you wanted to show us, maybe other panelists do. Are there other comments that anybody's just dying to make or feels that they're getting cheated out of by not coming up again for a minute or two?
I'll take privilege of time. I'll slap my website up on the screen.
Well, come and do it. We can just have it there in the background. How's that? Okay, well, thank you for being accommodating panelists and going with the flow here. So let's open it up then to questions and comments. And we do have a mobile microphone, so it is difficult to hear without the microphone. Please raise your hand high and I'll bring it around to you.
Push it.
I'm technologically challenged, sir. Okay, how about this?
This question is mostly for Dr. Johnson. I was wondering if you teach the American eugenics laws, and if so, how do you help students accept what happened there?
I do teach, in fact, we're doing that now in my sociology of disability. And I'm a believer in giving as many primary documents. In the case of this particular class, because we're talking about disability, eugenics fits right into that very nicely. We give them articles that were written during the period, as well as thoughtful articles that comment on these laws, etc. And the class is actually structured where the laws underlie from the ugly laws straight on through to ADA, so that the students are responsible for reading and talking about these different laws related, not just laws related to eugenics, but to disability more generally. So I do this with, I do use as many primary source documents as I can, and it's for any class that I've taught, it usually takes a long time to find the right balance of length and explanation, but I'm committed to it, and it works. So if you're interested in anything on eugenics, because you raised that specifically, I have quite a stockpile of things that I'd be happy to share with you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, I wanted to ask, well, it's more of a comment, I suppose, about the option of not so much doing comparative history, but relational histories of the two. And what I have done now for 2 semesters, in fact, is I teach the Holocaust on college level, which gives me very different opportunities, clearly, than what students can do in a high school. But I added James Whitman's book, Hitler's American Model, which doesn't just bring in Jim Crow, U.S. immigration policies, U.S. territories, and special forms of citizenship. So it discusses how the Germans, in fact, German lawyers used U.S. models, sort of as the cutting edge of racist legislation. This is what we wanted to do in the 1930s. So I was wondering if that's a productive way for others as well. I found it very productive. My students have found it very productive to think about and with that book, about the relationships rather than the comparisons.
Does anybody in the panel like?
I actually think teaching these things relationally makes a lot more sense than comparatively. When you compare, then that's when you run the risk of this idea of hierarchies, and they aren't comparable, because the system of slavery, as you know, and as everyone here knows, and Jim Crow, as one of the doctoral candidates mentioned earlier, it's so expansive, and so it's just, they're very different in some respects. I also try to use materials that, where the two groups, where African Americans and Jews, both their intertwining points and where they diverge. So it's very hard, but there's a book that I use by, I can't think of his name, he's at Emory University, he's a historian, Eric Goldstein, thank you. Eric Goldstein's book, which is really, really fantastic about helping students to see that Jewish people and African Americans, while they have an interrelated kind of history, there are times when Jewish people did blackface and all kinds of things. And so this helps students to understand that there is no, as many people have pointed out today, there is no one set of Jewish people for all time or one set of African Americans, but we share many things in common. And even as I do that, I also try to make ways to show the avid support that people like the Spingarn brothers and others showed historically for causes that were related to African Americans. I don't know if that gets to anything that you're...
There are also two histories of persecution going on at the same time, right? At the same time that fascism is happening in Europe, African American populations in this country are experiencing extreme violence, discrimination, all of the things that we've heard about today. One of the things that this new collection, and it's not on this site slapped up on the board today, but what will be there is an exploration of, for example, things like African American soldiers who are fighting in a segregated army against fascism. What does that understanding look like? They're coming home to an America in which the possibility of being lynched is high. What does that look like? And there are primary sources that will hopefully will be in that collection. I'm happy to share them later for anyone who's interested that point to that and that highlight that and highlight those. So it's not saying that A equals B, but it's saying A is going on at the same time as B. And how can these two things, how can we complicate both of these moments that are happening at the same time?
I think the documents from Jews who ended up, Jewish immigrants from Germany who ended up in historically black colleges.
That's some of it. That's some of it. But there's also, there are other types of materials as well that point to that. Yeah.
I think piggybacking on what you're saying, one of the things that I do in my class is not necessarily discuss the basis of many Nazi policies on American racist policies, and also not to forget the Native American genocide. That was one of the things that I was asked by many people, many teachers, many educators, many museum officials when I was in Germany, is they said, and tell me, how do you teach the Native American genocide. And I was like, well, first of all, they don't call it genocide. Second of all, it's kind of just there were Indians, and then there were no more Indians, and that's about it, you know. But one of the things that I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that was my educational experience with it. But one of the things that I do is that I find most powerful with my students is when we're talking about this, I talk about the Black American GIs coming home,
Right.
and then them asking, what is going on here? I'm over here fighting to liberate an entire continent, and I come back home and go ahead and put the chains back on, so to speak. Use me while I'm necessary for other people, but then when it comes to me, there's nothing.
I'm gonna be annoying and show one picture because it relates exactly to what was just said. Well, that's what I meant to do. So this is actually, this is an image that is the least graphic of his images, believe it or not. Arthur Schick was a Jewish emigre who was a Jewish refugee who was originally from Lodz in Warsaw, and this is from 1948. And the title, Lord, do not forgive them for they know what they do, is what is noted up here. And then he's got another note down at the bottom and a caption that is about how this is the lynching of he says Negroes is the greatest scourge on the emerging American democracy. So this is in 48. We don't think this was ever published. At least we can't see any place in which it was ever published. But it speaks a lot to what you were just talking about of servicemen coming home and not only coming from that segregated army, but finding what were we fighting for in the first place.
And another sort of parallel connection is survivors who came to the United States early on, maybe right after Kristallnacht, and lived through the segregated South. And tomorrow at 11, there is a student presentation on that, where she has interviewed some Birmingham survivors who lived in Birmingham during Civil Rights era. And so they too had to come to some kind of place of comfort in this unusual situation where they are moving from a hotbed of discrimination of their own to the hotbed of discrimination of other people. Mm-hmm. So it will be very interesting to hear what she found out.
I would just add, I mean, these are all very informative comments, and I'd just add in terms of relationships, I think of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Stanley Levinson. Dr. King got advice from Stanley Levinson. They were friends. Stanley Levinson would help him to write speeches and things of that nature. They were very close. Well, when these two communities start to work together, that can be threatening to some people. And J. Edgar Hoover goes to President Kennedy and leans on President Kennedy not to trust or work with Dr. Martin Luther King because of his friend Stanley Levinson, who in 2018, the word communist just seems not to be the same anymore. But it used to be such an awful tag that you could put on someone, communism in Russia. I don't know when that changed. But Stanley Levinson's purported past with communism was used against him. And at the end of the day, Kennedy exhorted Dr. Martin Luther King to break ties with Stanley Levinson. And King respectfully told Kennedy that he would choose his own friends. And they two continued to be friends, but behind the scenes, what Hoover had obtained through this confrontation over Stanley Levinson is he obtained the go-ahead for the COINTELPRO program that is going to dog the civil rights movement and the leaders of the civil rights movement. So the relationship is multifaceted, but it really should be researched and brought out more fully than it is.
as educators, I know that, we have to start with history. However, I believe the goal of what we're trying to do really is to teach the students where they've been so that they can have a vision of where they might go. And I was just wondering in your work if or how you may, I don't know that you would encourage, but if you could see in their reflections some kind of understanding that would lead them to be change agents, because we want to change the world, and this generation of younger students and even college students and others, are we helping them reflect so that they will be agents of change? And if so, what experiences or successes have you seen in that area?
Can I take that? At the University of Mississippi, we.
Could I encourage you to please go on up to the microphone so we can all hear you easily?
At the University of Mississippi, we had the Confederate icon, the old Georgia state flag, as a part of our state flag, and it remains so today. That flag used to hang on our campus. In our department, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, we have this phrase called doing sociology. And implicit in that idea of doing sociology is that you cannot just learn about social inequality or social injustices, but you have to do something about that. And the long story short is our students were able to muster enough strength. We have about 24,000 students, and then all the faculty and administration. They got support almost unanimously, and the bottom line is the flag doesn't fly on our campus anymore. That group of students was recognized nationally by the NAACP, and one of the leaders of that group was a sociology student who gathered with other African American and white students. They basically built a political machine that got buy-in from every single constituency on that campus. So we have a board in on our floor that says, basically, how have you been doing sociology? And so we encourage people in all of my classes. I always say, so what are you doing? And we try to give people tools to get those things done.
So I can't directly, where are you, Lynn? I can't directly answer your question, but first of all, there's an email thread going around from I think it's the Association of Holocaust Organizations right now, about actual evaluations of the effectiveness of teaching the Holocaust. And the museum has tried to measure this and has not been successful, or has not finished their efforts at this. And there's an outcry for that exact kind of documented information. I can't give you documented information, but I can tell you the responses from students and teachers. I just had a teacher 2 weeks ago send me an email that she received from a student who was in college and writing back about the impact of her Holocaust class on them, and it was probably changed them the most of any class they had ever had. I hear from teachers the impact of being able to explore the topics that are explored when you really get in depth with the Holocaust, the decision-making processes that people make, the kinds of things we're talking about, where the bystander, perpetrator, victim kind of questions. Where would you stand? Why would you make these decisions? Why do you think people made these decisions? You're allowing students at a very impressionable age the opportunity to explore their own personal being and their own decision making, and that's what this topic is about. Yes, it's history, but it's you don't have to shove it down their throats. It's there. When you start talking about these instances, historical incidences, and allowing them the opportunity to talk about it and to inquire, it just comes organically. And I don't know what everyone else's experience is, but it's a unique topic in that aspect. And I don't teach civil rights, but I would imagine it's very similar because it's a very personal topic.
I would like to piggyback on what Ann said, that I don't think there's any real way to quantify success rates with Holocaust or civil rights education. And the types of success that I want to see from my students, hopefully I won't be able to see for another 20 or 30 years. I'm looking for long-term, substantive, life-altering changes that affect the total course of their life. That's a small goal to achieve, right? So I'm not looking for anything small. I'm not looking for anything that I can say, there we go, I got it, you know, it worked. I'm looking for something 20 or 30 years down the line to show me that, okay, they are really empathizing with other people. They are really compassionate individuals. That's the main goal. It's actually the first thing in my school's mission statement. They say is they want to develop compassionate individuals. And so that's kind of the whole goal with that. What I do ask them to do every single day, when it was kind of funny, we were talking about the civil rights movement one time, and I was saying we would all love to go back to
that represented their culture and their stories. And we displayed that exhibition at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. We worked with Temple Emmanuel here in Birmingham. It was a project called Peace Birmingham, and again, that's an acronym, and that was people engaged in a cultural exchange. And we would bring together on the weekends Jewish African American students, and these Jewish and African American students would look at what was going on in the world around them. And it was really quite heartening, because there were some real serious conversations that these kids would get into, and the way that they looked at current events in the world was really something that I wish that I could share with everybody here, because their way of seeing things was not as loaded down as our way of seeing things. They had a way to just kind of cut straight through the BS and get to it. And currently we have the Legacy Program. And the Legacy Program, and by the way, I mentioned that we take our students to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. But Ann, please forgive me for not mentioning that. We take them right across town to the Birmingham Holocaust Education Center, where they are welcomed and they are taught and they are shared with. So I think this, for the Civil Rights Institute, what our role is like Odessa Woolfolk said, we are a common space where people can come together and learn from one another as we try to learn from the lessons of the past. And I think if we don't have that commonality, it makes us very susceptible to a lot of what's going on in our world today. I'm not sure about you, but I've been absolutely floored by the idea that our social space has been invaded by our enemies, and they're using our angst against us. I was watching where there were these twin protests created by people in Russia. And these protests were like, there was something African American, or there was something anti-Semitic, or there was something that was conservative or alt-right. And it's like gasoline. And these Russian bots are pouring more and more gasoline on these fires. And with us being balkanized the way we are in the United States, we make ourselves susceptible to that kind of attack. So we really need to take a hard look at young people and the way that they are relating to one another, and do it really, really fast, because this can get really, really bad.
Thank y'all for the presentations. There's a lot to unpack, and I don't have time for all the questions and comments I have for you. A couple of things that that I want us to keep in mind here. We're in Nazi Germany and the Jim Crow South. And we've been talking all around it in Nazi Germany here in the Jim Crow civil rights movement of the 60s. I think one of you made the comment, it's apples and oranges, we can't really compare the two. And I don't really agree with that. I think if you look at what's going on in Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1939 and what's going on in the American South at the same time, I think it's I think it's a very legitimate comparison. Those in Nazi Germany knew what was happening in the United States. Those in the United States knew what was going on in Germany. And you mentioned Whitman's book on the racial laws. You mentioned eugenics, that's Kuhl's book, The Nazi Connection, on the connection between American scientists and German scientists. One of the things that I would like to see more of, especially in more scholarship, is and this is things many of you know that I'm working on, is the impact of Nazi Germany, the war, and the Holocaust on the civil rights movement itself. You mentioned it began in 1877 and it's ongoing. I wholeheartedly agree with that. But I think if you look at civil rights histories, we skim over the 30s and the 40s very quickly. And to me, this is one of the essential areas to understand the civil rights movement, and especially to understand the leaders that are emerging into what we call the modern civil rights movement, the 54 to 68 movement. I'm interested in Dr. Wolfson's project that you're doing. You mentioned the returning veterans of cartoons. African Americans in the African American press were critical of the Nazis from the very beginning, from 1933. In fact, I think with Jay, I've shared a number of cartoons that are making direct comparisons. I mean, you're not going to have things like the WV campaign. You're not going to have the March on Washington movement without all this. And that's essential to understanding the modern civil rights movement. And so I'd like to see more of this.
Yeah, I can speak to what you just mentioned, and Jake has shared that with our team, and I can't tell you if all of those materials are going to wind up in this tool, but certainly some of them will.
I'm allergic to standing up here. Certainly some of those materials will make it into that tool, but that's a lot of the impetus behind that particular collection, is to really try to think about those points of intersection and to think about that moment in the 1930s and 40s, which, as you rightly point out, gets so very little play, if indeed any at all, and to think about how African Americans were interacting with, call it World War II, call it the Holocaust proper, we can call it all kinds of things, and certainly parse out the differences between A and B or the intersections between A and B, but think about that complex history from the perspective of those who are going through it, right? So from political cartoons, from editorials, whether it's student newspapers, whether it's very well-known African American thinkers, we certainly have examples of some of that as well, that there is this rich conversation that's already going on. And what does that look like? How is that informed or colored by everything that's already going on in the United States in terms of racism and lynching and that whole landscape? And how does that get brought to bear on this particular really complicated moment? So that's something that this tool is aiming to do in this upcoming collection.
Real quick, the similarities. There are a few. There are many. The big difference, however, between the Holocaust and the Civil Rights Movement, between 33 and 39, there was a push to expel all of the Jews from Germany. There was never a push to expel Black Americans. They wanted to, the white power wanted to keep Black Americans in a state of servility, staying within the area. Now, if they were straying from those social bounds, certainly they would expel them one way or another. And then from 39 to 45, the plan was to exterminate the Jews. That was never a plan with Black Americans. So the motivations behind the different processes really dictate.
A fundamental racial view of the Nazis.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the things that I mentioned. It was systematic. It was a systematic persecution of people based on factors outside of their control. In Europe, in Nazi Germany, Jews and their religion, and as the Germans called it, their Jewish ethnicity, and in America, Black Americans and their race. So there was that element, absolutely, systematic persecution of minority groups based on factors outside of their control. But the motivations behind that persecution are so vastly different that they create totally different circumstances.
Okay, well, I've been informed that we are basically out of time, so I really want to thank all our panelists for their responses and sharing ideas.